You're listening to Contesting Wrestling, the podcast where we talk about what fans love and what baffles everybody else about the world's most popular form of simulated combat. My name is Evan Burke. I'm a writer. I am not a fan of wrestling historically, but I am a fan of my two co-hosts whose friendship has lasted for decades, and their friendship with me and with each other. And I want to understand it. I want to try to get into what this thing is that elicits such fervent fandom in so many people.
And my name is Doc Diamondfire. I've been in pro wrestling for about 10 years now. I do a little bit of everything. I've known these two for a very long time, and I hope to lend my expertise as somebody on the inside.
I am Dr. Ben Abelson. I am a professor of philosophy at Mercy College, and I am and have been for most of my life an avid consumer of professional wrestling.
I had one question to ask before we dive into the meat of today. Gorilla Monsoon.
Yeah.
Is his name meant to conjure an image of a literal monsoon of gorillas? Like a Sharknado, but it's a monsoon filled with gorillas?
Perhaps.
Yeah, I don't see any evidence otherwise. He was a wrestler, and he was like...
I would hope so. I would hope that's not his given name.
Oh, you got to see him wrestle Muhammad Ali.
Yeah, he wrestled Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali was way into wrestling.
It wasn't really a match, but Muhammad Ali totally puts him over.
Yeah, he likes body slams Muhammad Ali and everything. But Ali loved it. Ali loved it.
Interesting.
He was big into wrestling.
My guess is that he's called Gorilla because he looks like a gorilla, and then he was like, "Monsoon is a cool word that could be my last name."
That's
my
respect.
There's gorillas in places of the world where it monsoons, according to Gorilla Monsoon's idea of the world when he named himself that, or when a promoter named it. Okay, did he give himself that name? Did Vince Sr. maybe give him that name? I don't know.
I am an avid attendee of fantasy, science fiction, and fantasy cons. And I have seen some nerdy fan that doesn't really know anything about the process of writing goes up to an author. I've seen like Hugo winners get asked this question. They go up to them. It's like, how do you come up with your names? Like, oh my God, like the names in this book are so cool. Like, what is it? And like sometimes the authors will try to play a game, but I saw just be really serious and say like, look, man, I just kind of sit there and make sounds until I find sounds that sound cool, and then I string them together, and then those are named, which is what the actual answer is for all fantasy authors. Yeah. Pretty much, like, unless you're pulling from historical sources, but you're pretty much just there going like La Nishandra, La Drangle, like, that's all it is.
Kal El.
Yeah,
we'll just go with it.
Yeah, it sounds. Yeah, people will buy it. So so respect Gorilla Monsoon. Sounds great. Love it.
His real name was Gino Morella.
Okay. So there's maybe he didn't make a big stretch.
No, well, he was a big, Italian dude. Very well respected up until his death. Respected.
And then
well
people immediately. Oh, okay. I was gonna say, and then people were like, "You know what? Fuck this guy."
It was kind of a sad situation where his son was a referee, who you may have even seen at this point, Joey Morella.
He reffed Hogan Andre.
There you go. He died in a car crash, I think, very young, and Gorilla was never the same after that.
I would imagine
he
not.
Wasted away. I think he developed cancer
a few years later, and he deteriorated, and we lost Gorilla. But we all love Gorilla. I always loved Gorilla's commentary because he sounded like he didn't care what anybody thought about what he was saying. He'd just be like, "This sucks. You're stupid. Don't contradict me. I'll beat you up." It's just great. It's great.
He's often wrong when he's arguing with Bobby Heenan.
Yeah, well...
Or Ventura.
But Heenan would cower from him. Ventura respected him, but Ventura wasn't going to be afraid of him. He's Jesse Ventura.
That's one of the things about Ventura I really like. We started talking about the announcers a little bit last time, is that, he always has an argument. And he's often pointing out the hypocrisy of the baby faces, particularly Hogan.
Okay, I see.
Understanding the motivation of characters is certainly... important.
And also, we always like villains better in part because villains are untethered and can actually say and do whatever they want, whereas heroes are the ones constrained by, I love the Marvel movies as much as anybody else. You're legally required to at this point.
Sure.
But, like, there's only a handful of actually interesting characters, and it's largely because the villains are, just allowed to do more things and have more character traits. All right. So today,
Speaking of villains,
this is an event that I have heard referred to in the past. It is something that I had heard podcasts about before because I am a podcast nerd and, heard the Radio Lab about this and stuff. It left my memory because I have the memory of a sponge. Not like my brain absorbs a lot, but I mean like literally a sponge, like as much as a sponge can remember things. I barely remember how I got here. And it has been referred to as a lot of things. It's been referred to as, the turning point in modern wrestling. It's been referred to in a way that fills me with apprehension. It's been referred to as the most interesting thing that happened in wrestling, which makes me, if we're going to do hundreds of episodes of this, and this is like episode 11, like I picked a bad subject.
I mean, I'll say one thing. It may be the most interesting also because it made subsequent wrestling so much more interesting than it would be otherwise.
Sure. Like it sort of added an extra dimension to wrestling that had not existed previously.
Right.
And I will say, so the things that I had to watch for this episode, let's give the details.
what are we talking about?
So we're
Still haven't
talking
said it.
we're talking about screwing. First of all, the good screw job is the so-called Montreal screw job, which is the match or occurs at the end of the match between Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels for the WWF Championship at Survivor Series 1997 in, of course, Montreal, Quebec, Canada. The bad match is between then women's champion Wendy Richter and the Spider in late 1985 at Madison Square Garden. And the Spider turns out to be the Fabulous Moolah. So, yeah, let's get started with Montreal. I'm really excited about this episode, largely because we're going to be probably talking about philosophy the most that we will in any episode, largely because of an insight that Evan had that he shared with us before the podcast. But we'll get to all that in a little bit.
This is also my first, this is the second or third Bret Hart match I've watched. And I think the first Shawn Michaels match we've watched for this, right?
You watched the Shawn Michaels and God versus Vince and Shane.
Yeah, that barely counts, but Shawn is, he's Shawn.
So yeah, Shawn Michaels is amazing. It's pretty much everything I want in a wrestling performer.
Especially the desecrating the Canadian flag, right?
The whole montage where he puts it in his nose, and then it's brilliant. It's brilliant. And
he knew exactly how good he was.
My God, they hate him. There are a lot of things I really liked about this match. And one of the things that immediately leapt out to me is that in comparison to every other WWE match we've watched, the crowd is so much more a character in this. Like, yes, in the other matches, like, you hear the reactions of the crowd, sure, and all that. But in this, like, both in the entrances, which were long. It was a very walking-heavy introduction. But, like, as they're coming in, I feel like they are closer to the fans. There is a lot more interaction between the fans and the wrestlers.
The fans are just fucking crazy.
Yeah.
Like the part where they go over the guardrail for a little while into the audience.
Oh, man.
And you see their faces up close. Some of these audience members, like, they're terrifying. Number one, they're almost entirely male. It's like almost 100%. And, maybe that's because wrestling appealed more to men at the time.
Sure.
But I think it's also equally because, if I were a woman, or I think most women would be fucking terrified to be in that place with those people.
Did you see the signs they were holding?
I have some signs.
Yeah,
I have some notes about signs.
Oh my God.
I don't even want to repeat half the stuff. I thought it was hilarious when I was like 14. I don't think it's so funny now.
I get the impression that there are as many wrestling fans in Canada as there are in America, and Canada just has 1/11 the population of America.
Well, Canada takes wrestling a lot more seriously in general.
Yeah.
Just, they see it more as a sport. Like, that's in certain cities especially, it became part of the identity. Montreal, of course, Montreal is a huge wrestling city going back for decades. Bret Hart and the Hart family are like very famous in Calgary, where they came up, where they used to run wrestling.
The part of Canada they're from, it's fucking cold. There's nothing around. They don't have shit to do, so they fucking go crazy about wrestling.
I watch all of these with the person that I'm married to because I'm just lucky she's into it. I thought this would drive us apart, but it's actually brought us closer together. And she pointed out, she was like, maybe because politeness is just so much more important in Canada, that there's a lot more. There's like if an American watches wrestling, I mean, sure, you're putting yourself there in terms of, oh, if I was big and strong and could throw people around. But also as an American, your everyday life is pretty hostile. Much like the wrestlers, you don't like the people around you. People are jerks to you. By the way, I've lived in New York City my whole life. I don't know if that in any way impacts my my impression here.
I moved to Philadelphia for a few years.
A place where people are much friendly. Yeah, exactly. That's
right.
the opposite of New York, and everybody there is friendly to each other and very respectful.
Oh, yes.
And then so yeah, maybe there's more projection going on. I did not watch the Jordan Peterson video where he talked about Bret Hart.
Neither did I.
Not out of honestly, I did think, I was like, I should watch it, but it just got to the point where I had like 8 hours of shit to watch for this episode. And
It's fine. Like most of his videos, you're not going to get much out of it.
No, he doesn't really actually make any points or anything. And then just read Joseph Campbell if you want to know about, if you want to read a racist guy make points about mythology that are kind of worthwhile. But anyway, oh, and yeah, and like even like somebody like throws a drink on Shawn Michaels.
Hits Shawn right in the head while he's walking down the aisle and just makes Shawn stronger and happier.
Yeah, he shrugs it off.
He just
Guess
like,
I got heat.
and I'm like, I'm just amazed that is allowed.
Let me say something about the long entrances. I thought it was interesting that they followed Shawn and Bret to the ring as if it were a documentary.
Yeah, there was like the entrance music didn't happen for a few seconds.
Because
like
they're trying to add this sense of realism to what's about to happen. Well, we'll get into that.
Yeah, and there's just a couple, like, is the European Championship, is that like a derogatory thing? Like, is that like, do they give that to people like, oh, you're the European champion? That doesn't matter as much.
But, okay, so it was only around for a little while. The first champion was an actual European, the British Bulldog. Then they have Shawn beat him for the title. Shawn carries the title for a while, wins the world title, and then he's like, oh, I have 2 belts. I don't need 2 belts. So he literally laid down for Triple H, so Triple H could be the European champion.
So it's not very meaningful to him.
It just falls off a cliff.
When it first existed, they did this whole tournament. It was Bulldog versus Owen Hart in the final. They made a big deal about it at first and then very quickly demoted it.
How do Americans feel about all of the Canadian patriotism that happens in right? Like, is there any American Canadian fan beef? Is it just sort of like America's
not really.
normal relationship with Canada?
Americans see it as the same way as if you go to another city and they're cheering for a different baseball team.
Okay.
You know, it makes perfect sense to us.
There is a sense that Canadians are batshit crazy. The Canadian fans, they're the crazy ones. Often when they do shows in Canada and they're cheering the heels and booing the faces, the announcers will refer to Canada as Bizarro World. They'll be like, oh yeah, we're in Bizarro World, Canada. Though actually in the last few years, I think there's been a marked reduction in the difference between Canadian and American audiences. American audiences have gotten smarter in a certain sense and more vocal and more critical and have sort of caught up to their Canadian counterparts, I think.
Before we get into the match itself, what is Vince's kayfabe role at this point? Because I know that he was an announcer, but in this match, like before any of like the shit goes down, it still shows him sort of walking around in like an almost managerial way. So what was his role at this time?
So going as far back to like the 80s, they wouldn't really acknowledge on television directly that he was the guy in charge, but everybody knew it. Who not even like within the wrestling world, he was known outside as like a businessman. He made all the big announcements. And so on. But at this point, they were in the middle of transitioning his character a little bit to one where they would be more open about him being the guy in charge. They had Bret Hart, start talking directly to him as a more realistic thing over the previous few months. The rise of Steve Austin was a big deal in that respect also, where Vince he was like the face of the company, and, fighting the man was real popular at the time.
And so, they had, when Bret Hart came out to announce that he was signing a long-term contract with the WWF, they had like close-ups of Vince during that segment and his emotional reactions to it. A lot of Bret had been bickering on TV about his role in the company for a long time, and he often directed those comments directly to Vince McMahon. As Doc pointed out, the character of Steve Austin was on the rise. They had a whole situation in which Vince himself was telling Austin that he couldn't wrestle because he had a broken neck, and Austin hit Vince McMahon with the Stone Cold Stunner. So he's becoming much more active. I'm not quite sure. Was Vince just relaying the information to Austin, or was he saying, no, I'm telling you that you can't wrestle?
He was using vague corporate speak. He was like, the World Wrestling Federation says that you can't do this. It was pretty clear that he was in charge.
So he had also done that speech on Raw where he announced that the product was changing its tone and things like that. Like, he came out and was like, we're going to do things differently now.
The Brett Screwed Brett interview that Vince gives, that's the first time he says on the wrestling program, I am the owner of the WWE. That's the first time it's openly acknowledged, I guess.
It's definitely where the page turned and he was the owner character.
Okay.
Hard stop. So we're talking about the Montreal Screwjob. Most of it is not what you see on the screen. Most of it is this whole other story. Do you want to go over the match itself first?
I have a few brief things I want to say about the match.
Yeah, because I'd like to talk about the match a little bit.
Yeah.
But I do. But you go on first. What were your reactions to Bret Hart versus Shawn Michaels, two of the best in their time, in their prime?
So I've said on this podcast before that wrestling is, for me, like improv comedy. A lot of things are like this. I'm just more familiar with improv, where that when you see it at any level below the top level, it's kind of not go do something else with your time. Go read a book. Go listen to an album, just something. But then when you see the best of it, it is truly goddamn thrilling. I loved this match first off, it never starts. Or it
they
beat the
7 minutes into it when they get in the ring, because you can't start it until you're in the ring.
One of the commentators describes the match before it even starts as, it's just a down and dirty fight between two guys who hate each other's guts.
By the way, the lead announcer there is Jim Ross. We've watched, I think, 1 or 2 matches with Jim Ross. And while I say that Gorilla and Ventura are the best announced team of all time, I think pretty much unequivocally Jim Ross is the greatest single wrestling announcer ever.
Play-by-play guy.
He brings a drama and an emotion to calling the matches that no one has ever come close to.
He does seem to say, I don't know, he didn't infuriate me at all.
He's still doing it on television. He is now the lead announcer for the new AEW promotion.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
They brought back Tony fucking Schiavone, though.
I know.
It feels so much like WCW, and the way they were talking about it, Schiavone himself, he's like, oh yeah, back in our first show on TNT, we did this and that, and it's like, dudes, this is not helping.
Well, you gotta, we're probably gonna edit most of this out, but this is a wrestling podcast. You haven't been listening to Schiavone and Jim Ross's podcast. They're relevant now.
No, I get it.
Schiavone is more relevant now than he's been in 15 years, at least.
But here's the real problem with AEW is that they're popular with us, right? With people like us. They're popular with people who remember WCW. If they really want to challenge the WWE, they got to appeal to the kids.
Well, I think
or at least younger people, like adolescents,
They have some time to work on that. Based on their first show, they're already pushing new guys. They already have younger guys. They got the older guys to get you in the door. It's up to everyone else to keep you there. And we'll see.
It's kind of like did you watch the new Dark Crystal miniseries? No. It was great. I really enjoyed it. But as I was watching it, I definitely kind of had this who exactly is this for? Because I was like, it's still very YA, which not there's anything wrong with YA. I like YA, but I was like, it seems like it is definitely directed towards a younger audience, but this is also clearly for people who were born in the 80s and watched this movie as children.
All of us adult babies.
And then,
Yes.
yeah, exactly. Shawn Michaels is amazing.
Yeah.
He sells amazingly well. He reminds me of when you're a child and you just could run around the playground and flail. And before I learned shame,
Can you imagine he had back problems after this?
that's one of the least surprising things. Because he also is the king of, they'll like throw him down onto the mat and he will bounce from the mat, which has to not be good for you.
It's interesting, too, the way you put that in describing him, because that was the whole conflict between him and Brett, or at least the way he put it in his promos was like, I'm living my life free and open, and I do my thing. You're all restricted by whatever, like, bullshit morals or standards of decency or whatever you think you have. I'm living my best life here.
Probably one of the biggest stylistic influences on wrestlers in general, in terms of like their actual style that they dress, is David Lee Roth. Like a lot of wrestlers are David Lee Roth.
Yeah, it's true.
Shawn Michaels is more David Lee Roth than almost any other any other wrestler.
But how crazy that there's Brett Michaels from Poison.
Shawn Michaels used to be in a tag team called The Rockers. And that was their gimmick, is basically they were both like David Lee Roth. They were a more refined version of the Rock and Roll Express, which was a lot more kind of old time, like almost country rock and roll. Rock and Roll Express at the time of this recording was reported just won the NWA tag team titles in their 60s.
I mean, Shawn is definitely
boy.
rocking. He is definitely rocking a style that in the rest of the world was only seen in like 1991.
Yeah.
Because he really is a fusion of grunge and 80s metal. Like he looks like a combination of Kip Winger and Shannon Hoon.
Yeah, he looks like Lane Staley before the turn.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he is
or Phil Anselmo. Yeah,
Phil Anselmo, right before the turn.
He is the Facelift album, which is basically just a hair metal album.
Yeah, I do love it.
It's great.
We would be remiss if we didn't mention, for those who have never seen him before, that he does sing his own entrance music.
Mm-hmm.
What?
And it is about how he is a sexy boy.
Wait, that is him singing
That is.
the song? Okay, because it's not a good song.
The original version had Sherry, because Sherry was his manager for a while, singing about how he is a sexy boy, is her sexy
It was
boy.
more or less the same lyrics.
But once she stopped being his manager, he re-recorded it from the first person. He's not your boy toy. Also,
It's a garbage song, but that does make me respect him a lot more, I have to say.
According to Shawn, he could not believe how good he sounded when he finally heard the produced version of the recording, based on his experience of himself when he was recording it. Like, that's what they got after like all of the studio magic at their disposal.
Wow.
Yeah,
I mean,
a half-spoken, low reverb, like, and he knows it. He knows what he's good at, and he knows what he's not good at.
I'm glad he's got a healthy approach to it. Because, know what you're good. Don't try to sing. Don't try to sing if you can't sing. It's painful.
So they brawl for several minutes before they even get to the ring, and then once they get to the ring, they still kind of fight each other like people who are like fighting each other.
It feels really real. You can see the distinction in their style, not just in their fashion sense, but also in the way that they are wrestling. They obviously have very different physical styles, come from different schools. Maybe they actually had beef at the time. It seems like that could be a real thing.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think, Ben, you seemed delighted by my reaction to, because the match ended and we were in the group chat and I was just like, wait, that's fucking it? And which I imagine must have been the reaction of all wrestling fans at the time.
Yeah.
I had no, like, what the fuck just happened?
Right. Shawn Michaels puts Bret Hart in his own finishing move, the sharpshooter.
And you can see Bret like putting himself in it. Like he gives Shawn one of his legs, basically.
Like, this is how you turn. You go this way. Because Shawn doesn't do the sharpshooter.
He was never good at it.
Yeah, he wasn't much of a submissions guy, really.
He's really more the Buster Keaton of wrestling.
Yeah. There you go. He'll stand there and the whole ring will fall directly around him. And then he'll look at the camera. Right, so he puts Bret Hart in the sharpshooter and the ref goes, hey, what? Ring the bell. And then the ref gets the hell out of there. And then Sean gets the hell out of there, and the show goes off the air.
Well, first, Brett spits directly in Vince McMahon's face.
Yes.
And then in the aftermath, he like destroys the announce table and smashes a bunch
Footage
of
of that
monitors.
comes out, later. He went around and destroyed everything in production.
And the story is he then went backstage, and a number of wrestlers attest to this. Found Vince McMahon. I think he said, if you're still here, I'm going to take a shower. If you're still here when I get back, I'm going to punch you in the face.
It was in the dressing room Brett was using, and all of Brett's guys were using. Vince had come in to talk to him, and Brett told him, I'm going to take a shower. If you're still here, I'm going to punch you in the face.
So Brett takes a shower. He comes back. Vince still there. He punches him in the face. Vince shows up on Raw the next night with a big black eye. Now, to me... And I mean, we're going to get into all this.
Well, now's the time.
Like,
Let's do it.
They did that in order to work the boys. Like, they did that thing with Brett punching Vince so publicly so that the rest of the wrestlers would be convinced that Vince McMahon and Bret Hart really have beef. Because I'm going to tell you right now, I'm coming straight out and saying it, I am a Montreal Screwjob truther. I don't believe the official story at all. I'm with guys like Scott Hall and now the referee of the match, Earl Hebner, in thinking the whole thing was a work in the sense that Brett was in on it. Doc's going to give you the official story.
Yeah, well, I definitely, I'm not exactly a Montreal truther, but for anybody who happens to not know, like, what was going on, Bret Hart had a long-term contract with the WWF. And Vince told him, I can't really honor your contract. I know that you had been...
Wait, you should go back a little bit further.
In the beginning.
Go back to when Brett was offered the big contract from WCW that he turned down.
Yeah. So he was offered a big contract by WCW when his WWF contract had come up. And he decided to go with Vince's offer of less money, but a 20-year contract offering him stability. Instead of a $1 million contract with WCW at the time, and I think this is important because Vince brags about being a billionaire so much as part of his character. Vince was not a billionaire at this point. Company that owned WCW was a $1 billion company, and Vince was kind of on the ropes for the first time since WrestleMania 1. Ratings were down, money was going down, it was looking bad.
So when Vince presents himself as the underdog in this situation with WCW, there is kind of some truth to that. Like
he is absolutely the underdog. At this
Okay.
point, the WWF was a privately owned company by Vince and like a little board of directors and people who had been running it for a long time. They were very successful. They grew from the regional promotion to the national wrestling promotion, and then when WCW, which was owned by Turner Broadcasting,
Who was funneling money
they
into WCW.
they wanted to compete, and they did very effectively. And the WWF's bottom line started going down. Plus, there were several scandals. There was the steroid distribution scandal, which Vince was found not guilty of. There was the IRS scrutinizing the WWF heavily, which they found they were doing nothing wrong.
And as we've talked about before, WCW got all of their big talent. They got Hogan, they
Right.
got Savage, they got Hall and Nash. They created the NWO, which was a huge hit.
Yeah, and this was in the middle of all of that. People were changing the channel to Nitro, which was broadcast at the same time as Raw. So yeah, Vince was very much the underdog.
So Brett signs this long-term contract,
Yeah.
comes out on Raw, and says, I think I'm going to be with the WWF forever. And you see a little gleam in Vince's eye. I don't know if there was a tear maybe
A sigh.
or something like that. And like it's like, oh, all, warm, lovey-dovey shit.
So Brett and Sean were not really ingratiated to each other backstage. Sean was, a horrible egomaniac. Everybody, including Sean by now, talks openly about how much of an asshole he was to everybody. He knew how good he was. He was in tremendous pain. He was developing a pill addiction, etc. Vince came to Brett and said, look, I don't think I can honor this contract. Would you like to reopen negotiations with WCW? See if you can't get that big money. And Brett accepted that offer, went back into negotiations with WCW, got a contract that would pay $2.8 million over 3 years. It's a lot of money, man, for limited dates, I might add, for a lot less work than he would be doing in the WWF. But the problem was, Brett was the world champion at the time, so they were like, well, you have to drop the belt. And he's like, okay. And they're like, well, we want you to drop the belt at Survivor Series to Shawn Michaels. And
In Montreal.
in Montreal, and Brett
in Canada.
And Brett refused because him and Shawn had been beefing so hard. If it was up to Brett, he would have dropped the belt either to Steve Austin or to Mick Foley, or he would have laid the belt down on Raw and thanked the fans and left without losing it at all.
Or at least lost it to Shawn not in Canada.
Right.
Yeah, that's like, I mean, you don't ask Rush to open for Metallica when you're in Canada, right?
Yeah, right.
So and so as Brett describes it, it would be like the suicide of his character. It would be the execution of his character if this were to happen.
It would be like he hitmaned himself.
Yeah. So Brett took himself way too seriously, and that's the official version.
That's the official version, is that Brett refused to lose the title in Canada.
At that point.
He came to an agreement with Vince McMahon where they were going to do a schmoz. There was going to be like a double disqualification.
Yeah, a bunch of people were going to run out and they'd disqualify everyone, and then they'd deal with it the next night on Raw.
That's a schmoz.
Yeah.
And he'd lay down the belt on Raw the next night. But what actually happened was they do the match. Vince, I guess, tells Hebner in his earpiece or whatever to ring the bell.
Well, the story is they did tell Earl right before, they went out, like, this is what's happening. And right afterwards, they gave Earl a huge raise. And like I said, a getaway vehicle, essentially. So the crowd was not happy. Several people figured out what happened immediately.
I mean, I was worried when they got into the audience. Yeah. I was really worried for Shawn Michaels. I was like, oh my God, like, I'm glad that I know that Shawn Michaels is still alive right now, because I would be worried for his life. And this is not real. So like, if somebody actually got fucked here, like, I wouldn't put it past those fans to riot, like,
it's happened.
As if somebody had either won or lost a soccer game in a small city in the UK.
Hockey game in Canada.
Hockey
also.
game, yeah, there we go.
So according once again to the story that is told in like the Monday Night War and all of that, they try to figure out. They keep giving Brett scenarios where he would lose the title, and he kept refusing. And eventually, as they said, Vince was in a room with a couple of his right-hand man and Shawn Michaels and Triple H. And at the time, Triple H was kind of Shawn Michaels' sidekick, starting to get a little, his nose into it a bit. And Vince is like, well, what should we do? And Triple H, as he says in interview after interview about this, he said, well, I looked up and I said, well, if he's not going to do business, we have to do business for him, right? Which is really old wrestling carny talk for, like, if he's not going to lose, we're going to make him lose.
But they've all changed their stories several times on how that conversation went down.
Well, Shawn initially denied that he knew anything about it.
Right.
That eventually revealed that he was in on it the whole time. And all of them say that Vince told them to tell everybody that only Vince was in on it. Only Vince and obviously the referee.
Okay, so our sources for
the
all
big
of this
question
information.
Is who knew and who didn't.
Right. Specifically about Brett.
Well, yeah.
That's the main thing, is whether Brett knew or not. So our information, our sources for most of what we know about this and for why the fans came to believe that this was real, that Brett wasn't in on it and that he really got screwed, are a few things. First of all, there's the very conveniently produced documentary on Bret Hart. It just happened that there was a documentary team already following him around, chronicling his life, so they just happened to be there when all this shit went down. And you see in the film Wrestling with Shadows, you see scenes where Bret discusses all this stuff, the contract stuff, Vince saying that he couldn't afford him, and the aftermath, all of it. And
I watched at least some of that movie, and there are absolutely scenes in there that very much have a performance vibe. There's also scenes that really do seem real, that really do just seem like talking heads, like people talking about Brett at the time.
But the ones relevant to the screw job are the ones that seem performative.
The expository scenes seem performatory, definitely. Now, so because the real crux of this is that there's no way that what happened, like, there's no way that if it was entirely orchestrated, where everybody was in on it, there's no reason they would have done it this way, right?
Sure.
Yeah, that's
so there's no way that it was an entirely pre-planned work where Vince McMahon sat down and said, we're gonna take this to a new metal level, now to make
Oh.
it like so like there that is off the table.
I think that there wasn't too much long-term planning. Well, the long-term plan, and I think this often gets missed, is that the long-term plan already was WrestleMania 14, Steve Austin wins the title. He'll be healthy by then. He could have faced Brett. He could have faced Shawn, but WrestleMania 14, Steve Austin wins the title. We just have to get there with the integrity of the championship intact.
But to me, they were thinking this. They were thinking, one, they were already building Vince as the heel Mr. McMahon character as an antagonist to Steve Austin. So this was going to build into that. And at the same time, Brett was going to leave, and they needed to protect his character in leaving.
So I just mean in the sense that if this was entirely pre-planned, there's no situation where anybody involved in the production of wrestling shows would want a match that ends this way.
Oh no!
Even if they're faking it, like
just
that,
like abruptly weird, and then you cut. No.
Yeah, in which the audience doesn't know what to feel, which is that is the ultimate law to, or that is the worst thing to do in any performance context, is to leave the audience, I guess, unless you're trying to deliberately confuse them, but to leave them like, what? I feel unresolved and I don't know what.
You certainly don't want an arena full of people.
No.
If you're doing your small studio production in front of 30 theater heads, that's fine.
Sure.
They can all go and discuss things at the local wine bar.
If you can get around
not 20. If you have 20,000 people and all of them don't know how to feel at the end of a show where they've been being served alcohol and screaming and their blood is pumping, violence is going to happen
at
next.
least 5 of them will die.
Yeah. Violence.
So it is something you would want to avoid.
Did I mention the ref
Definitely.
got the hell out of there as quickly as possible? Several times yet. I think that's important.
So a couple more things on the sources. The wrestler Mick Foley, who I'm sure we'll talk about quite a bit in this podcast,
Yeah.
he wrote a best-selling autobiography called Have a Nice Day. And in it, he talks about his reaction to the screw job. And he believed it, at least from what he says, 100%. And he was incredibly upset about it. He almost quit the company because of it. So that, I think, also lent a lot of credence to it, was that even the boys were buying it.
Well, I don't think they told a lot of people. The question is whether or not Brett knew, but they really, they couldn't have told everybody.
So then
way more people would have said, I knew about it by now. It's been 20 years.
So I think the thing that lends the most credence to it, on that note, is Bret Hart's own behavior for the 10 years afterwards. If you ask anyone around him, I think his family, his friends, everyone, he was just a bitter, angry, upset motherfucker. If you watch this shoot interview he came out with sometime in the early 2000s, he's just totally bitter about it. If you read his autobiography, damn, I forgot to bring it with me. I wanted to read the last paragraph of the autobiography, where he basically says, I will never forgive Vince McMahon for this. I will never forgive Shawn Michaels for this. I will always hate them. And that's the end of his fucking autobiography.
Bret Hart took himself way too seriously.
Or so he wants you to think. So
no.
I met,
Whatever the response to this is, Bret Hart takes himself way too seriously.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
But so I met Bret Hart at a Ring of Honor show in about 2006 or 7.
Yeah.
And I was wearing this T-shirt that my girlfriend at the time had made for me that said Gotch screwed Hackenschmidt 1908.
Well, he put like oil on his body to make it slick. That was cheating.
It was a reference to this wrestling match in 1908 where, there's rumors of misconduct.
Some kind of chicanery.
So I said to Bret, I was like, hey, Bret, do you like my shirt? And he said this. I'll do my best Bret Hart impression. He was like, oh, yeah, there were a bunch of those. I wasn't the first.
Well, all right.
Oh, man.
So all right, now the idea of whether or not somebody would have stuck with this story for so long.
Right. So that's what seems.
That kind of gets into I had a couple of revelations about wrestling. Do you want to finish your point?
I have a little bit more to say.
Okay, you finish your point.
So the thing is, that would mean, how could, for a whole fucking decade, how could he keep this shit up? That would seem really compelling to me, except for the fact that 2 years later, his fucking brother dies on Vince McMahon's watch, plummets from the ceiling because of a problem they had with a stunt where he was supposed to descend from the ceiling on a wire. His brother dies. So he has some real fucking shit to be bitter about.
Absolutely.
So he can just be bitter about all of it together. And the real shit that he has to be bitter about lends credence to the other shit. So I think that if Owen hadn't died, and also if Brett hadn't had his career ended by Goldberg kicking him in the head wrong,
fucking Goldberg, man.
Goldberg, right?
Jesus Christ. When will it stop? When will somebody put a stop to his reign of shit?
I think Brett would have taken Eric Bischoff's money, taken Ted Turner's money, done WCW for however long. In the meantime, Owen Hart would have become a megastar in the WWF, and then Brett would have gone back and they would have done an incredible program. But because Owen died, that was never going to happen. And if you listen to the Radio Lab, they have a clip from Brett in an interview where he says, yeah, I could never go back to WWF after my brother died because any storyline we did, I think he said would be like pathetically meaningless compared to this real shit that happened. That doesn't sound like someone who's upset about like a fucking thing that happened in wrestling.
Yeah. That sounds like a deep-seated. I mean, I guess I could see him truly blaming Vince and that being enough to to be all of it. But
so I think we all would have learned that it was a big work.
Yeah.
Or like they wouldn't have come out and said that, but we would have seen the payoff for it if Owen hadn't died. And it's because we didn't see the payoff. Because if you look at the bad match that we're going to talk about later, the thing that leads credence to that being real is just that nothing came of it.
I see. Okay,
they didn't make any money off of it.
So you're saying that it was it was setting up for there was going to be some sort of return, there was going to be some sort of payoff, and then Owen dies, and then maybe after Owen dies, even Vince was like, there's no point, let's not even try to do another thing, and
also Brett couldn't wrestle anymore.
Yeah, Brett couldn't wrestle anymore. They were deep enough into the post-Brett era where it would have been like, who gives a shit?
And Brett did come back.
Well, that was
more than 10 years later.
Eventually, yes.
And had a WrestleMania match against Vince where he beat the shit out of him with a chair, and the whole Hart family beat the shit out of Vince, and it was great.
They were very careful not to have Brett do anything that would remotely cause him to be in any physical distress the entire time. Anytime something like gingerly hit him and he was like to fall down, it's not like he took any bumps. He'd like grab at his face, turn around, go down to his knees, go down to his hip, and then lay down.
He seemed, at least in the stuff from 2014, he seems like he at least is still like mentally
he's
like,
lucid.
Like there.
He had a stroke, but he's lucid.
I mean, stroke and a lot of concussions, and still like being like there that's an accomplishment.
This year there was actually an incident at the Hall of Fame. He and his tag team partner Jim the Anvil Neidhart were being inducted as a tag team, and a fan jumped the guardrail and tackled Brett.
Oh, I think I remember. I remember you talking about this.
Yeah, that was a scary moment. But he got up and brushed himself off and finished his speech. It was fine.
Instead of a big podium setup, they did a different kind of thing where they had it being in the middle of the ring. So some guy jumped out of the audience and tackles Brett, and then most of the roster who were in the first few rows all jump in the ring to get this guy. It was.
Why would you? Yeah. Why? I guess when you're in insane fan territory, you can't really. There's not a lot of logic to it.
He just said that he felt it was time.
It's time to
jump in the
guy.
ring and tackle Bret Hart.
I mean, who amongst us doesn't feel that sometimes walking down the street, talking to your boss?
So I really want to say Ben, that's really some great fantasy booking, and I wish that all of that would have happened. But the thing that makes me think that all of that is is not how it went is that the way that they say it went makes perfect sense. Vince was on the ropes. A wrestler who has taken himself way too seriously for years didn't want to drop the title, so they made him drop the title, had in fact happened in wrestling many times. It created a lot of great buzz, and they capitalized on it, and they moved forward and got to where they had to get to.
But to me, it makes way too much sense, because if you look at the TV leading up to that shit, what do you have? You have Brett talking about being screwed. You have the development of the evil Vince character. You have all of this talk about the contract and all this stuff that they never did before. all of that, it's like when I watched the Monday Night War episode on this,
Yeah.
I was like, oh yeah, this is a very well put together wrestling storyline. That's the way it reads when you watch that.
Well, Brett wasn't the only one complaining about being screwed, though. Shawn Michaels was for most of the previous year. It was the main thing of Austin's character at the time. It was just the way baby faces were baby facing at the time. It was the style.
Well,
And they came up with the ultimate way to illustrate it.
I think this is where I started to really understand. I knew that there was a meta aspect to wrestling. I knew that there was this whole idea of blending what's real and what's fake and da-da-da, and that this is one of the best, if not the best example of that happening. But I guess this is the first time that it really occurred to me a few things. One, that the WWE really is a nation state unto itself. Any company in America is kind of its own nation state, right? You ostensibly have freedom of speech in the country until you go to your job, in which case your speech wildly restricts and the range of acceptable behavior wildly restricts itself, as I've learned getting fired from dozens of places. But this particularly, like, it has, I mean, they produce propaganda. Like, that is all.
Yeah. Yes.
This is the first time I've watched non-wrestling WWE content, and it is the most blatant propaganda I've ever seen from anything.
Oh, the Monday Night War, the series produced 10 years after they defeated their enemy, the company that's out of bed they own now, so they can say whatever they want about them. Yeah.
It is programming in more senses than just, putting together a TV schedule.
Oh, definitely.
So I was listening to, shout out to a great podcast, The Discourse with Chad Vigorous. I was listening to that, and he was interviewing a guy named Aubrey Sitterson, I believe. I'm really sorry if anybody involved hears this and I am mispronouncing the name. But he is creating a graphic novel that is a history of wrestling, the name of which I forget, but it'll be in the show notes for this episode. And he was talking about how, he was talking about the carnival roots of wrestling, and that wrestling has less to do with theater and more to do with either magic or kind of like
con artistry.
Con artistry.
Yes.
The idea you're conning somebody into believing that it's real. You're conning them so they will part with their money. And that's it. Yeah, it's like getting somebody to play a rigged game a little bit. And then it's also sort of like a magic trick in that it's like, you go in and you agree to believe in magic for a while, and then somebody blows your mind, and then maybe they take your money. There's a quote from either Penn or Teller, I can't remember which, but they were talking about magic, and they said, yeah, the real trick to magic is that when somebody's like, oh my God, how did he do that trick? The one thing they'd never guess is he must have spent thousands of hours by himself in his house getting really, really good at making it look like this fork can melt. Yeah. And, he must just be committing himself in a way that no reasonable human being would do. And that is basically the trick of wrestling, is that
practice.
It's like, oh, how do you guys do this and maintain it? Oh, it's just my entire life. That's how I'm good at this. That's how we pull this off, is that I grew up in it and I breathed it and I train every day and I do all this and
Scott Hall said when he was on the WWF's 300-day-a-year schedule, he said that the real upside to it is to get real good at wrestling, doing it every day.
We had a conversation about acting in wrestling, and you were like, no, they would have never had an actor. They would have never thought of it as acting. They never would have, and that was something that I was really having trouble with, because I was like, you're clearly acting, right? You're performing in some fucking capacity.
And I think people get the wrong idea about wrestling because they're like, the acting is so bad, because they think of it as acting.
And I feel like I really couldn't let that go, because I was looking at it and it does look like acting. If you were to describe it to somebody, it has all of the same components as acting, but it's not, because it is rooted in con artistry and it's rooted in magic, and really it's a lot more like lying than it is like acting.
So there's this philosopher, Harry Frankfurt. He wrote a book, I think in the early 2000s, called On Bullshit. You might remember it from the aisle in Barnes & Noble when you used to go to physical bookstores, if you're old enough for that sort of thing. In the stocking stuffer aisle, he was selling this tiny little book So it's probably one of the most read pieces of philosophy of the last 20 years. It's also probably the most influential philosophical idea of the last 20 years is this distinction between lying and bullshit. I think it really, I think it got into the zeitgeist partially because Frankfurt did an episode of The Daily Show when Jon Stewart was on it. And I think even more so because it was a very useful concept for people to draw on when criticizing Donald Trump right around the time he became president, saying that, oh, he's not really lying because in order to lie, you have to have actually a belief about what's true, and you're trying to get someone to believe the opposite of that. Whereas when you're bullshitting, you have no belief or even interest in truth or falsity. You are talking not in order to communicate information, whether true or false, but for some other purpose, to get some sort of reaction out of a person, to make them feel a certain way, to manipulate them in a certain way, not to convey information.
That's how you do a wrestling promo.
Well, actually, Evan was saying the opposite.
So yeah, so my point was that so acting like is kind of more like bullshit in the sense that part of what makes bullshit so captivating is that it is a mixture of lying and truth, and that it's not the point of it isn't that. Like if you go see a play, the actors are, I mean, sure, you can philosophically ask the question, is acting lying, but like I would say that if you go see a play, everybody in the play knows that you know that you're watching a play. So they're not trying to convince you that it's actually real. They're not trying to lie to you about what is happening. They're just trying to tell a story, and they're trying to basically, present a lot of truths in terms of they are acting truthfully. They're trying to convey how human beings would feel in the events being depicted in the play. Whereas in wrestling, like, yes, there is a storytelling component, certainly, but it really is the main thing they're doing, ostensibly. Maybe it's not as true now that everybody is a smart mark, but
yeah, a little less.
Classically speaking.
But classically speaking, they are trying to convince you this is real, and everything they are doing is to distract you from the fact that it is not, or that it is, preconceived, at least.
Trying to get you to believe things that are false and conceal the truth. And the concealing of the truth, I think, is even more important. I think there is opacity. There is opaqueness at every level of professional wrestling. And correct me if I'm wrong, Doc, but it seems to me that, I've heard announcers talk about how they don't tell the announcers what's going to happen because they want them to have genuine responses to it. And I think unless you are Vince McMahon, unless you're at the very top, you never get the full story about what's happening.
Yeah, people, you will generally know what they're doing and a bit about what other people are doing. You can find out what other people are doing. Being an announcer or commentator, I've often just known what was happening. But you can just go and call what you see. And if you don't know what's about to happen, that's often better because you can have a genuine reaction.
The idea that an actor would continue playing a character for years and years and years and saying like, oh, the things that happened on this show were true, is pretty ridiculous. If somebody did do that, it would be very sad and something. But I can absolutely imagine, I mean, if you tell a lie for a really long time and then that just sort of becomes your truth, I could see a wrestler keeping a lie up for years.
On that note, I wasn't always a Montreal truther. The switch flipped for me once when I was sitting with my father, my now late father, Raziel Abelson, also a philosopher. And we were sitting there, and he never really liked wrestling. He didn't even believe that WWF and WCW were at odds at all. And I was talking to him about the Screwjob once, and he said to me, Ben, why do you think that it was real? Like, why do you believe anything any of these people ever say? They're professional liars. And I realized that my whole reason for buying into it was only what they had said about it. Like, I don't, I can't know, I don't know Bret Hart personally, right? And I have this idea in my head that, one, he takes himself too seriously, so that kind of thing could have happened. And two, that he's a really, respectable, honest dude. But why the fuck do I think that? So when I started thinking about this, suddenly it occurred to me, wait, maybe it isn't real. And then like very soon after that, I was like, you know what? I don't think it is. I think Brett knew about it. And then I started thinking, well, maybe the WWF and WCW were never really at odds. Because our whole evidence for that is Vince McMahon telling us that he had a break with Ted Turner early on. They used to be on his network, and then they had and all that shit. Fuck, I don't know.
Well, there's a lot more evidence that the WWF and WCW were at odds, like the competing TV shows, the fact that one of them went out of business.
Right, but I mean, if just Vince and Turner had planned that shit together and they were the only ones who knew, if they were the only ones who knew, none of that other stuff would have mattered.
Well, the big work in there is Vince McMahon convincing you that WCW had almost anything to do with Ted Turner. Turner owned it like Turner owned a bunch of media, corporations, and nobody tries to keep that image up outside of the WWF to this day. Even Eric Bischoff will be like, yeah, we saw Ted, once or twice a year, and, he funded our company, but it's not like we had unlimited funds like everyone says we do. That's a Vince McMahon narrative.
But Bischoff does maintain that Turner was giving them more and more funds specifically to beat the WWF.
Well, yes, but only after Eric Bischoff had made the company profitable in the first place, after it had stopped losing money. Turner had said to Eric Bischoff, this is Bischoff's story anyway, and you can take this for what it's worth. He said, well, what can we do to compete with the WWF? And Bischoff said, well, they have, prime time, knowing that they're live on prime time. We're at 6:05 on Saturdays, knowing that, Ted wouldn't have much to say to that, to which Ted turned to one of his other corporate officers who had nothing to do with wrestling and said, all right, give Eric 2 hours every Monday night on TNT. And then they had to figure out a live TV show on TNT. And,
sure.
And there you go. And then Ted didn't have much to do with it other than trying to sign, the biggest names.
So then case it's just a matter of scale.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly.
There's nothing else you watch where you're going to assume that there's all this stuff happening that you don't know about.
I mean,
right? Because there's no you don't watch a TV show and then if somebody pitched a TV show that continued after the show was over, and kept going between the episodes, and everybody involved had to really do it, and basically the actors all had to be in a 24/7 LARPing situation during the entirety of the show, that would be ridiculous. That would be an insane thing. It would also not work. It would probably stop being funny after all. So I guess it is.
That's very popular. It's called
it's
professional
reality
sports.
TV.
And reality TV.
Well, reality TV
Reality
is very
TV
different.
is more scripted than wrestling. Professional sports is what you're talking about.
Yeah, because reality...
everybody, and that's where the sports connection comes in. They want to sell it as a sport, and if it's a sport, you accept that you're only seeing these people when they're playing, and then there's the rest of their lives. And if you're the kind of fan that wants to get autographs and follow the pitchers around and the batters around and find out what their lives are like, you can do that too.
But what's so beautifully seductive about wrestling is that it invites you to be this detective, right? There's always something you're not seeing, and I think Radiolab made pointed this out well in their episode. And this guy David Shoemaker they had on, who's written some stuff about this, and I think other people have made this point. That's one of the things that's kind of unique about wrestling is it invites criticism, it invites scrutiny, and endlessly. Right?
Because you'll never know. You'll never know the answer. No, you can't ever be sure anyone's giving you a straight answer. It's like asking a fucking carny how the games work. They're not going to tell you. They'll never know. Even if they are really, really seemingly honest about it, even if it's a carny who retired 30 years ago, why would he still give a shit? No, he's not going to tell. I mean, I'm making a lot of assumptions about carnies here.
And it's the same thing with American politics.
Oh, God, yeah.
This is when people say fucking Trump is like a wrestling character and that like politics is like wrestling. This is what it's really about.
That is absolutely. Yeah. I feel like I did not fully understand that.
You don't really know who's saying what to who and what's going on and where the power lies. Hulk Hogan knew where the power lied. That's why he was on top for so long. It's a reference to something that he said. Never mind.
You saw the promo where he puts his hand, he points to his hand. He's like, "This is where the power lies, brother."
Maybe
it was a pretty frequent.
I think it was the Warrior.
I'll believe
WrestleMania 6.
I believe you if you're telling me that I saw that.
I want to bring out one more philosophical concept that I think is relevant here. and that it might actually capture some of what you were already talking about, Evan. This guy, Tamar Gendler, came up with the concept of an a-leaf. Not a belief, an a-leaf. And so it's something that functions kind of like a belief, in that it guides behavior like beliefs do. It comes up sometimes in the discussion about implicit bias. An a-leaf, it guides behavior like a belief does. It's a kind of attitude towards the world in the way that a belief is a kind of attitude towards a belief, but it's often in conflict with one's explicit beliefs. So, for instance, in the concept in implicit racism or something, if I walk down the street and there's a black person, I might have the belief that a black person is no more threatening than a white person, but because of implicit racism and that kind of stuff, I might still react in a way that I wouldn't react to a white person, something like that.
Sure, and when you have things like that, it takes a huge amount of work and conscious effort.
The example that they commonly give is if you're afraid of heights and you're, looking down through, let's say, a transparent floor, like to 100 feet below,
Sure.
and you believe that the floor is perfectly solid and you're perfectly safe, but you still feel like you're in danger. You believe you're in danger even though you don't believe it.
You watch a scary movie, and then if it really does get you, I watched Hereditary. I spent a couple weeks going like, is award-winning actress Toni Collette in the ceiling gonna come after me? And then even though I was reasonably sure that isn't true.
So, now that most wrestling fans know that it's a work or whatever, what are they trying? What is the attitude that wrestling fans have towards wrestling? On the one hand, you could say they're suspending disbelief, but I don't think that's right, because the usual wrestling fans are thinking about how it could be done better. They're super overcritical and stuff. They're thinking about how it's a work the whole time. They're not suspending their disbelief. They disbelieve, but they still believe. They have emotional reactions towards what's happening that are like the emotional reactions you would have if you believed it was real, except without the belief.
You could argue that one of the big points of art, and one of the big points of storytelling especially, is to create a safe environment for you to feel extreme things. A really, really sad movie about, dealing with death and grief is kind of a thing that simulates you feeling that, but in a safe environment where you're not going to. Or a horror movie, people love horror movies because it simulates, it makes your brain kind of think you're being stalked by a killer while you also know it is not true.
Yeah, these are ideas. There's actually a whole literature on the philosophy of horror, on why we like horror, and this is one of the prevailing theories.
Thacker, one of those guys, talks about that?
Well, Thacker isn't really part of that conversation. Noel Carroll has a theory.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure that particular theory comes from a guy named John Morial.
Okay.
But yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And I that's the theory that I think. Well, I think there's something in Noel Carroll's view too. Noel Carroll thinks, and this is relevant here as well, that what we like about horror is finding out about the monster. It's like a kind of rational discovery, and which eventually leaves us not as afraid as we were when the monster was shadowy and mysterious.
And I guess it really is the few times in my life that I have seen a horror movie that then really stuck with me after, the first time I saw Mulholland Drive, and that scene with the homeless guy, and I spent a week every time I opened a shower curtain or something I was expecting, and then I had to go back and watch it again to kind of take the power away, so I could watch it again and be like, no, it's just an actor in makeup. It's just shot in a particular way that elicits a nightmare. I had to watch Hereditary again. Those are basically the two movies that really that did that to me. So I could watch it again and be like, yeah, it's just kind of a silly movie.
Our friend Spoon once made the point that he felt like he was most afraid in the apprehension of going to the horror movie. Before he saw, oh my God, what am I going to see? And what is it going to do to me? How am I going to react? And then after actually watching it, it's like, oh, it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be.
Yeah. I like that. All right, we should wrap this up.
Well,
We still have to talk about the bad match.
We didn't
Oh,
talk
shit.
about Spider Lady.
Look, the bad match is another screw job that happened earlier in the 80s and 85. Wendy Richter was the champion. They wanted her to sign a new contract. She wanted more money. They didn't want to negotiate. So they sent her out for her title defense. And instead of the opponent she was supposed to have, they sent out the Spider, which was actually the fabulous Moolah in a mask. And Moolah basically, interestingly, wrestles a whole match with Richter.
Yeah,
you know,
they
like
work.
pins her a couple of times where Richter kicks out.
Yeah.
And then suddenly wraps her into what looks like maybe it should have been a small package. Richter's shoulders are clearly not on the mat, but the ref counts to 3. Moolah is awarded the title. Richter seems very upset. She leaves for a while. She comes back. She rips the title away from Moolah. She looks right at the camera and says, "Oh, this is how you're going to play it, McMahon?" And I thought it was funny that they left all of that in the video.
Well, this was before they were so slickly edited. I mean, this was like right around the time of WrestleMania 1. It was a little bit after that. Vince had started signing everybody to exclusive contracts. The story was he gave her a contract that day and said, "You got to sign this now." And she's like, "I don't know." Then they sent her out there and took the title away from her. Wendy Richter was, and people like don't really remember this, she was the number 2 star in the WWF at the time behind Hogan. She was enormous.
She had Cyndi Lauper in her corner.
She had Cyndi Lauper in her corner. But if she wasn't, and Vince was a lot more cutthroat at that point because the rest of the territories were still there, and they were not happy at what Vince was doing. And his attitude at that point is, if you're not all in with me, you can go find work somewhere else if you think somebody else is going to do better than me.
I did enjoy this match considerably more than any of the Hogan matches I watched, to be entirely honest.
Well, the arrogance of Moolah just pours through everything she does. And she's like this old lady at that point. You could see the people in the crowd when they go outside knew it was her and were chanting Moolah, Moolah at her.
Even Gorilla Monsoon says, "I think it's probably Moolah."
Yeah.
Is part of the inherent nature of a screw job that the bell goes off and nobody knows what the fuck is going on?
Pretty much. It's we're gonna, you know, you're gonna lose.
So, you know, this goes back to the earliest days of wrestling when they first decided that it was all going to be a work, this Goldust trio. And they always had to have the hooker or the shooter, the guy who could legitimately beat anyone, so that if someone didn't want to do business, they could just forcibly take the title off of them.
They could do business for you, you know. And that allowed the hooker to lose the title because you could be reasonably sure that the person they lose the title to can drop it back.
What's really interesting about that to me is that the hooker or shooter ended up becoming an archetypal character in wrestling. Like every generation of wrestling has the guy who everyone thinks is really the best and could really beat everyone.
Yeah.
Brett was kind of that for his era. Chris Benoit was another one. Yeah. Daniel Bryan these days, sort of.
Yeah, he's very well respected.
Brock Lesnar is actually the best example of that.
Right. I think we all would not want to fight Brock Lesnar in a fight. He would fight us all right in the face.
What do you think, Evan? Oh, which one of us are you with? You think that Brett was in on it or not?
Oh man. Okay, you know what? I'll say this. I did think that watching like the Wrestling with Shadows stuff and that some of it absolutely seemed staged.
And
Some
Bruce
of it
Pritchard
seems-
is definitely lying when he says Brett that Vince didn't know he was going to come out of heel out of the Brett Screwed Brett promo.
I don't know
All right,
about that.
I will say this.
I don't know about
I
that.
guess I honestly kind of come down on it in the same way. I believe pretty much the same thing I believe about most conspiracies in general, which is that I don't know if I doubt that I am like a full-on truther for it, but I also am sure that the official story is not what happens. Like I
Got a
don't
few holes.
I
in it.
don't I don't know, you know, like who
I
who
will
knows?
say this is not exactly a conspiracy theory. I mean, I guess it is a conspiracy theory to
It's
some sense.
precisely a conspiracy theory.
But most conspiracy theories depend on all of these people getting together and keeping shit from everybody else. Whereas in this case, we're only talking about one person,
Yeah.
right? It's all and you know, Brett's the only person. Brett and Vince, really, two people, are the only people who had to keep the secret.
Well, if I could bring it back quickly to like Penn and Teller, one of the best parts about their act is they'll be like, okay, now we're going to do the trick with transparent cups so you can see how we do it. And then you watch them and you still can't see how they did it. And that's, and they've told us everything they know about the Montreal Screwjob, but we still don't really know what the truth is.
It absolutely seems like they had a plan and that got fucked. That absolutely it definitely seems like a situation where somebody had to improvise. That is the vibe I got. There's no way that the entirety of what's gone down and the entirety of the explanation is something that everybody involved was on board with from the beginning. That does not seem.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I think that
everybody involved here that's relevant again is Brett and Vince.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that the scenario that you came up in place of what the official story is has to be correct.
Oh no, sure, certainly not. Yeah.
I don't think Brett was in on it. I think the whole idea was let's just get the damn title off of Brett, and tomorrow we don't have to deal with him anymore.
By the way, Earl Hebner, I think I mentioned this already, but I'll say it again. The referee in the match has come out and said that he believes Brett was in on it now. So the guy with the best chance of knowing.
Perhaps.
I will say that anytime I have ever seen two or more people endeavor to pull off some large complex plan without other people realizing what's going on, something always goes wrong. Something always goes wrong. And this seems like it just has too many working parts for, I don't know. So that's what I'm saying, is that I don't know, I don't think it was entirely planned from the beginning with everything. I think maybe they had an idea of, and then maybe the thing that went wrong was Owen died.
And that's the thing that I think that messed it all up was Owen dying.
I could totally believe that everything before that was something that they had come up with together and were planning a comeback, and then Brett just got hurt emotionally and physically and genuinely blamed Vince for fucking up. Which also, I don't know a ton about the death of Owen Hart, but I mean, if he fell to his death from a faulty mechanism at Vince's show, it kind of is Vince's fault.
Yeah, that's a whole other debate and story, and there is information on that if you want to check it out.
I will say there is one other person who's in a position to know the deal: Brett's wife, right? Because they did the whole Wrestling Shadows. If they staged all that Wrestling Shadows shit, at least she probably would have had to be in on it.
She probably would have said something by now.
I have a feeling that a woman who married into the Hart family is at least somewhat familiar with how to maintain kayfabe.
They are divorced now.
Yeah. That's ex-wife.
But at the time.
And would she have come out and said something?
I don't know. Okay. I guess we can end on this. He talks about the nightmare of watching his father torture people growing up and stuff like that. In wrestling, if the goal is to not hurt each other, why would you teach guys how to hurt each other?
That's especially interesting with Brett, he didn't even do chops because he was like, no, we're not supposed to hurt each other. It's just supposed to be the illusion. The guy coming from the fucking dungeon of torture, I guess, if you need to. That's really what it was all about, is if you need to. I think I mentioned this before. If you're in a bar and someone says wrestling is fake, you got to be prepared to fight them for real.
And also, Stu Hart came from the school that you got to show people that this is serious, even if you're winning or losing based on the booker's word. And if you can't handle that, you can leave.
I even remember Mike Quackenbush from Chikara this one time before you were a wrestler there, Doc.
Yeah.
We were fans at the King of Trios.
Yeah.
And they did Quackenbush did a little exhibition in the ring where he showed us some stuff, and he'd put on a hold and he'd be like, well, here's how you do it so it looks good for wrestling, and then here's what you do if you really want to hurt someone with
it. Move somebody's leg 3 degrees in the wrong direction and it starts to be incredibly painful.
All right, well, on that note, this has been Contesting Wrestling. This has been a fascinating episode. I definitely feel like I leveled up in my understanding of wrestling. I did enjoy this match. For our next episode...
Well, Evan has a hard-on for Shawn Michaels.
I seriously, there was a point... If you look at my notes, it's 70% Shawn Michaels. I am definitely a little entranced by this man. And I also, the theme for the next episode came to me after the Hogan episodes, where I was like, I need to watch some matches that I will like, or I'm going to fucking shoot myself and we're not going to put this podcast out. So you guys have to find some matches that I will enjoy.
So the good match is going to be Shawn Michaels versus Kurt Angle from WrestleMania 21, which was in 2005. Michaels and Angle at the height of their powers.
Unbelievable. You'll see.
And the bad match, it's hard to find a bad Shawn Michaels match.
And
it
this
really
match is not bad
Yeah.
per se.
No.
Which is good, because I would like to watch two good matches.
Yeah,
That would
yeah.
be nice.
But it has
Yeah.
been largely criticized by many people, and I think the flaws are very clear to Doc and myself.
Yeah, we'll get into them.
But it's from WrestleMania 11 in 1995. So these matches are 10 years apart.
10 years apart, yes.
And it's Shawn Michaels versus Diesel for the WWF Championship. And if you want to hang out after that match, you can watch Lawrence Taylor wrestle Bam Bam Bigelow.
Right.
Alrighty. My name is Evan Burke. You can read my writing at evanburke.biz. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at evanburke, etc. You should follow this show on Twitter at contestingw. You should support us on Patreon, patreon.com/contestingwrestling. Find us on Instagram and Facebook at Contesting Wrestling Podcast.
I'm Dr. Ben Abelson. I remain such at ScribeBen on Instagram and Twitter. And you can find my faculty page at mercy.edu.
My name is Doc Diamondfire. You can find me on Twitter at Dr. Diamondfire. That's at Dr. Diamondfire. I'm available for ring announcing, commentating, and even wrestling. So send me a message and I can come to your show. And thank you very much for listening this week.
Alrighty. This has been Contesting Wrestling. Thank you. See you next week.